even as I recognize, like the abolitionists, that horrors occurred, I, for one, maybe because I'm too close to the facts, I know in every detail what had been done to the people of Gaza before October 7th. I'm too close to it. My innards writhe each time I read another human rights report. I squint and flinch when I think targeting amputees. This country is completely mad. It's lunatic. And this is not after October 7th. I'm talking about March 2018. Their hatred, their loathing, their contempt for these Palestinians. It's like, when I was a kid, I don't claim to be a saint. I'm not. I'm very far from it. If you knew my flaws, they would frighten and terrify you. I remember as a kid, one of the games we used to play, listen to me, we took what was called a magnifying glass. They were much more popular back then. It's the glass that bends the light into a beam. And our fun was to take the magnifying glass, bend the light to burn to a crisp ants. That was what kids did. They burned to a crisp ants, and it was fun watching the ant hills, just implode from the pressure of the light beam. And that's the Israelis with the Palestinians. The fun of targeting amputees. It's the truth. That's why when everybody now is shocked by the videos of the Israelis posting as they incinerate houses or kill Palestinians and how joyful they are and how euphoric they are, I'm not surprised at all. That's
Norm,
what I've been reading for 15 years.
yeah. No, Norm, can I ask? I mean, you've used. There's a couple of words you've used over the course so far of this conversation. You've called the Israeli government satanic, lunatic, which I know as well. It's a reference to a piece you recently published on your Substack, Samson and Cassandra, where you sort of made that argument. And another piece you recently wrote on there, when it's okay to nuke a country, and sort of. I think we'll talk about Iran slightly later on, so I'll just leave that for a second. But I would just say those descriptions, those acts, when it's okay to nuke a country, saying that it's satanic, saying that it's a lunatic nation. I know it's a slightly clumsy comparison to make, the one that I'm about to, but you are Jewish, your parents were in concentration camps, and I wonder if you worry about sort of the fact that the impact, I should say, that rhetoric like that can have, whether it's about, fueling a rise in anti-Semitism or opening a door for people to be anti-Semitic in their criticism. I just wonder how you've rationalized those two things with particularly the sort of, the language that you're using to talk about the state of Israel.
Well, look, Ali, I'll treat you as somebody I know and not try to put on an air and estrange one from the other. I'll give you an honest answer. I would say there was a point in my life where my self-identification as Jewish would have caused me to hesitate before uttering statements or descriptives of the kind I just did. And I'm speaking with complete candor, and I think with utter sincerity. And I know what I'm about to say will probably surprise you. I don't see Israel as a Jewish state. It's a type. The Israeli type is not the type I grew up with as a Jew. As a Jew growing up, being Jewish meant being cerebral. Yes, it meant being cerebral. We took great pride. Can you imagine the pride Jews took in the fact that the four great figures of the modern world, Einstein, Freud, Marx, and some would include Jesus, were Jewish? We surged with pride at that fact. Do you know the kind of pride we took? That 25% of the Nobel laureates are Jewish, even though they represent 0.00002% of the world population? Yes, the life of the mind loomed large being Jewish. It also meant being creative, and creative also with a kind of shlemiel. It's hard to translate shlemiel. It means kind of weakling aspect. So for us, a Jew meant Woody Allen. It did for us growing up. Or Franz Kafka with the big ears. That was being a Jew. Lining up along a perimeter fence and targeting double amputees, sorry. That has nothing to do with a Jew or Jews as I grew up understanding that notion. So I don't feel Israel as a Jewish state. I don't. I think it's a lunatic state. So it doesn't, at this point in my life, I don't feel the kind of conflict personal conflict that you allude to. However, I do recognize that Israel calling itself a Jewish state and carrying on as it does is going to increase the danger of anti-Semitism. But that's a problem, in my opinion, first of all, created by the state of Israel. I would much rather it not call itself, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people. I would rather call itself Israel, the nation state of the lunatic people, or Meshuggah. We have in Yiddish the expression Meshuggah, which means crazy. So the nation state of the Meshuggah people, that would, I think, diminish the prospects of anti-Semitism increasing as Israel carries on. And then the other side is, fortunately, we've reached a point where a large number of Jews have, to use an expression I heard a few months ago, have checked out of Hotel Zion, which is to say they don't want to have anything to do with the state, and that's a good thing.
I've thought a lot about the one-state solution. I've done a lot of work recently thinking about binationalism. What would a federated authority look like? What's the history of calling for a federated binational vision? I've been reading material from the 30s and 40s when people were hoping that whatever state emerged in 1948 would be binational and would guarantee equality for all people. I want a political solution. I actually want a constitutional solution. I am not an advocate of violence, and I don't believe that understanding historically how Hamas formed after the bitter disappointment of the Oslo Accords, and understanding how its aims were established and how its aims were revised in 2017, that I think it would be useful to understand how they formed so that we might be more effective in convincing them to lay down their arms. That is my view. And unfortunately, though, you could just call them terrorists and be done with it. You could just call them evil and be done with it. But then we're learning nothing. And we're not learning how we might find an end to violence, which is my ultimate goal.
I do shy away from using the phrase terrorism, right? Because I think it nearly always is a pejorative. It's nearly always used to describe your opponents. And whilst with the we might use the lexicon of, to describe the bombardment of Gaza as a war crime, why is it that what Hamas did on October 7th, why don't we say that that's a war crime? Why do we say that that's terrorism? And I often think the distinction is essentially kind of reveals your own biases.
Yes.
I understand that point.
Yes.
The thing I struggle to understand that I heard you say in that previous interview, I think you used the phrase, you said that it wasn't an anti-Semitic attack. And I didn't really understand what you meant by that. Could you talk about that a little
Yes.
bit?
Well, I think we've all seen, or many of us have seen, footage where Hamas militants are jubilant about having killed Jews.
Yeah.
So that is clearly anti-Semitic, and there's no question about that. Do we think that Hamas is committing violence against Israeli citizens because primarily they are anti-Semitic, or do we think that these violent acts are part of a larger struggle to emerge from colonial domination? I think we have to open that question. I'm not saying that anti-Semitism isn't part of it. For many Palestinians, the only Jews they've ever met have been soldiers. I remember going to Ramallah and meeting people who said, "Oh, the only Jew I've ever met is a soldier. You're the first one." And I was like, wow, really? What does that do to your idea of what a Jew is? So, but I think if we say it's only or exclusively anti-Semitic, that they just hate the Jews, we're not understanding that they also hate living under colonial subjugation. Gaza has been under siege for decades. When it wasn't literally occupied, as it is now, it was still under siege, and it did not have autonomy as a state or as a political entity. Doesn't have rights of movement. It doesn't have control over its own electricity and water, or even the amount of food or building materials that can come in through the border. It is surrounded by soldiers and has been. So that people want to be liberated from that life is no surprise. And I think if we say, oh, they just hate the Jews, we imagine that they would be happier being colonized by another group of people. So how do we think about the anti-colonial struggle and the way it is intermixed with anti-Semitism in this instance? I think it's complex, it's sensitive, but it certainly deserves some careful thinking.
Israel in the US is not a foreign policy issue, it's a domestic issue. It's a purely domestic issue. And there comes many segments of the society, many actors, many pressure points, including the biggest Zionist organization, and that is not any Jewish organization. The biggest number of Zionists in the world are the Christian Zionists and the evangelicals, who believe in that dispensationalist theory that started here in England. And it's a long story. But also, it's not the only thing. There is the arms trade and the arms industry. There is the strategic element that, we needed a base in the Middle East to make sure that the Middle East is under some sort of control. And so far with all this, Israel for the West has proven to be a net burden. I mean, a net burden in every sense. A burden on our ability to maintain a world that is peaceful, a burden to maintain a region that has some economic opportunities. And you see, every time there is an issue in Palestine, it goes all over the world. It goes viral, it's a global issue. It visits you in the streets of London and Washington, and New York and Brussels and what have you. So perhaps we need to make sure that we continue with the people in the West, as we are doing with the British people. And we need to make sure, especially the younger generations, your generation, are going to look at this differently. And perhaps I believe that the battle is being won, including in the US. And you've seen the incumbents in the US, and the incumbents that started in Columbia and Harvard and here and there are not just something that happens suddenly. It's building up, and it's historic, because the last time it happened, something like this in the US, was in 1968, the anti-Vietnam War. So it takes generations to accumulate and to build up and to reach that peak moment. So I think in the US we have many good news, and in the UK we have. So Israel needs to think. It needs to think. It's the main reason why Israel was able to do all the atrocities it did since 1980, since 1948 until now. is because of the unconditional, unequivocal support by the West. That support is waning, absolutely waning. And while it might not be waning by governments and administrations, it's waning underneath all that. The public, the civil society, even the political parties, it's waning. And this logic for all these decades that you can only use your muscles but not your brain. And look what they have done in Gaza, look what they're doing in Lebanon. Muscles. Muscles means here mass violence, mass murder, mass destruction, that's muscles. While the West, they use brain with Israel, but never muscles. They use the carrots, never the stick. And I think we need to build a situation whereby the world uses, not only with Israel, but with any bad actor, a combination of carrots and sticks, like we did with South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and how the world managed to help collapsing that apartheid. The same has got to happen in our situation.
In the immediate future, do you have hope when it comes to administrations and governments to see what's happening for what it is and to act and to use their, as you said, their muscle on Israel to bring an end, bring a ceasefire, and change the dynamic in the region?
Oh yes, I'm very hopeful about that. And my hope is because of the people. In the end, the West is made of democracies, and politicians do calculate. Up until recently, they never felt the cost of wrong policies on Palestine. It was rare. They only felt the policies vis-a-vis Israel. So they would be rewarded immediately if they take a stand in support of Israel, whatever policy Israel does, illegal always. Or they would be punished if they take a stand against Israel. And your history is full of these politicians who are either rewarded or punished. And some, their careers ended. But now it has flipped upside down. In the last elections, in July, Palestine was squarely part of that election. And many people made clear, many British people made it clear that they are voting because they want to see a different policy by the UK on Palestine. Several MPs were elected only on the Palestine ticket. And they call themselves now, they have a bloc. But also the Labour Party realized that many people actually could have voted in a certain direction, but their satisfaction with the policies on Palestine was not there. So the wheels of history, even in the West, are definitely going in an opposite direction of what Israel has been wanting and has built and done to make sure that the West will blindly support it. That blind spot is being exposed by the people. And in the end, it will ripple affect the governments, sooner or later.
Genocide started in 1948. It's simply becoming more lethal, more bloodthirsty, less bearable than it ever was. The complicity of the West is mind-numbing and indisputable. Here you have an apartheid state. It is clearly an apartheid state. Anybody who's been to the West Bank knows it's an apartheid state. They've built walls and they've built roads exclusively for the use of the illegal settlers that the local population cannot use. That's apartheid. So you have an apartheid state which has always tried to merge the Zionist ideology, the Zionist narrative, with the facts on the ground. The Zionist narrative from the 1910s was a land without a people for a people without a land. In other words, terra nullius is what the British did in Australia. They said, Captain Cook arrives and declares that Australia to be empty of people. So the Aborigines are not people, so kill them. Right? Genocide. It's the first step. Terra nullius is the first step towards genocide. So that's the Zionist project. A land without a people for a people without a land. Now, of course, there were people there. There were millions of people there.
There were.
So now the IDF is in the process of ensuring that the Zionist allegory, slogan, becomes a fact on the ground. They're getting rid of them. The whole point is to expel them, to kill them, to drive them away. They do not want to kill them all. I mean, they want to kill as many as is necessary to convince the rest to leave. You can see that in the West Bank, because people say to me, but Yanis, how can you possibly support Hamas? I'm not supporting Hamas. Netanyahu supported Hamas. Likud and Netanyahu were in the business of diminishing the authority of the PLO, and they have been for decades supporting Hamas financially, politically, militarily, until they completely destroyed the capacity of the PLO, of the Palestinian Authority, to appeal to the Palestinian people, and only Hamas is left to represent them. And in any case, let's say that we press a button and Hamas disappear. They just disappear. They're all convinced. They're brainwashed by some wonderful piece of artificial intelligence delivered by drones, to give up, to surrender. What happens in the West Bank? Hamas are not there. The ethnic cleansing, the genocide is continuing there. And of course, you can see that they just want the land, not to mention the natural gas deposits, which are off Gaza. So this is what's happening. The West, especially those who claim to care about human rights, we must accept that we have now proven beyond dispute that we never cared, as countries, as polities, as establishments, as media, about human rights. We only cared about our human rights and the human rights of our friends, of our bastards, right? If you are not one of us, you don't have human rights. You can be bombed, you're never killed. Even if we kill you, you die. Whenever they say, hang on, what's happening? They are terrorists, right? So, never before has the West's image around the world been so terrible. What is happening is, at once, in the West, opinion, public opinion, conventional wisdom is solidifying its support for Israel's genocide, but the rest of the world is becoming more and more disillusioned with the so-called principles or ethical dimension of the Western polity, of the Western way of thinking.
You mentioned drones there, and I would like to, if we have time, to cover the intersection of sort of techno-feudalism and this conflict. But can we just hone in for a second on sort of the shifting of Israel's stated war aims? Because initially we were told it's the destruction of Hamas, right? Which poses its own questions, because does that mean the military infrastructure? Does that mean the nurses that are employed in the Hamas-run health ministry, for example? But that was the initial stated aim. And gradually the rhetoric has changed to security control in Gaza. The rhetoric is shifting. And I wonder, first of all, what you believe the actual war aim is for Israel. And secondly, whether you think that aim is achievable.
The original war aim has always been to take over the land from the river to the sea as part of a greater Israel, to expel half of the Palestinians and to keep the other half as bonded slaves. That was it. The original apartheid idea of the white supremacists, the Boers in South Africa. That's why we call it an apartheid state. That was always the case. Up until the 7th of October, that plan was working magnificently, because you and I were not even discussing Palestine, at least not to the extent that we are. Especially public opinion worldwide had accepted that it was over, that Israel had won, that the Palestinians in Gaza were fading. 60% of children before the 7th of October were malnourished. So the embargo was effectively killing them softly, slowly. And it was just a matter of time before, the people living there would want to get out. And the land would be cleared, and there would be settlers and so on. While in the West Bank, you had something like 200,000 settlers 10, 15 years ago. Now you have 800, 900,000. So they keep settling. They go straight from Boston or Brooklyn, or they go straight to a house of a Palestinian that has been thrown out of his home illegally in occupied land. So that was the aim. On the 7th of October, Hamas's actions shook the military establishment, the intelligence establishment in Israel, because they realized that they had not contained them to the extent that they had hoped they would. But that was a magnificent opportunity for them, essentially to kill lots of Palestinians, and to use that setback in their intelligence community as an opportunity for speeding up the process of genocide. That's what it is. And as far as Netanyahu is concerned, his war aim is that the war doesn't end. An endless war, because he knows that the moment it ends, he loses the prime ministership.
You were in Brussels, banging the drum is probably not the right way to describe it, but you have been vocal on Palestine in Brussels for years now. How did it feel to be, I suppose, coming against a brick wall almost, that you're trying to spread awareness and I mean, you only need to look at social media to see how much reception by the wider public you've gotten for your stance on this. But how did it feel to be within that space and not kind of see the reciprocity of your view?
Well, I suppose, politics is a bubble. It's becoming increasingly a bubble in Ireland, whereas there's a disconnect from those in power with the people on the ground. But in Brussels, multiply that by 100. They're in a complete bubble of self-vindication where they are they answer the tune of corporate interests, be it the military-industrial complex, big pharma, big agri. That's who they answer to. And they obviously tell them that they're doing a great job. And within that, in terms of foreign policy, you did have a lot of Zionists in the parliament. But generally speaking, there was a huge reception across the board from the staff in the parliament. There was been incredible displays of solidarity from the staff. I mean, they work in an institution. I didn't fully believe ever the EU mantra that they are a force for democracy and good and human rights for all that. You only need to look at what they do in their own countries to know that that's not true, but they peddle themselves on that. But a lot of the staff working there believe that the European Union did represent democracy and values and rule of law. And then when they saw direct complicity and green lighting of the genocide, they were horror-struck. They were literally traumatised, and we had an incredible meeting, which they tried to get cancelled, with Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, which was packed to the gills with hundreds of staff across the institutions, and there was a lot of bullying. A lot of staff of Palestinian origin lost, one man nearly lost 100 of his family there, and he worked in the institutions. Can you imagine working for an organisation and then hearing its leaders basically goading and continuing on that genocide? So you do it because you represent what's real, and that's a bubble, and they are the past. Like, Israel is finished after this. They have nowhere else to go, and it may not seem like that because the EU and the US have their backs at the moment, but I firmly believe that this is this generation's Vietnam. Things will never be the same after this, and a whole layer of young people and people who are older who never paid attention to this issue are not going to let it go until there is justice for Palestine and this issue is dealt with. It's absolutely tragic that it's happening at such a terrible cost and that still it continues, but it is the harbinger of a big change as well. So you have a job to do, you have a responsibility, and anywhere I got elected, I never saw it as an end in itself. People say, oh, vote for me and I'll do this. That's nonsense. I would say vote for me and I will use the platform to shine a light on issues that other people are afraid to go to because of the media or whatever. A lot of people in politics, they spend their lives trying to get elected, and then when they get elected, they just want to stay there. So they don't want to offend anyone, they don't want to do anything, they walk down the middle of the road. Not interested in that. We had a job to do. We were able to use the platform to voice the real opinion of the majority of decent Europeans, Americans, and people all over the world, because we look at things in a really Atlanticist way here in Ireland. Our media is really Western focused, but the majority of the world's population lives in countries who don't think like that, who have a different view. We never hear that reflected, and it doesn't mean that anyone is right and anyone is wrong, but dialogue and an exchange of views and treating people with respect, honour and difference and all of that is the only way forward. But unfortunately, the administration in the US and in the EU now is being hijacked by the military-industrial complex, which Michael T. said in a recent talk is the most dangerous organisation on the planet.
When there's like a more than heavier than usual attack, suddenly the Western media go, oh no, Israel, that's too much, come on. It's like, but they were terrorists. There were people in the hospital and we had to go in and kill them. Oh, okay, all right. You know, like remember, I mean, you have remember this scene when like Israeli forces like were dressed as doctors and nurses and went into a hospital in the West Bank and killed 3 people.
Yeah.
Why? It's like, because there are terrorists. Yeah, okay. And you know, like this is an example how Israel defines terrorism. 2010, there's a woman named Suad Zoyqat and her husband were killed. And then a few years later, she published a Facebook post that's like, may God unite us in heaven. And because of that post, she was accused of being a terrorist and she was put under detention in a prison for 8 months. This is how they define who's a terrorist. You know, they kill UN workers. Today, 7 people died from the International Central Kitchen. First, okay, it's Hamas. And it's like, oh, it's us, but oops, mistakes happen. Well, it's us. What can you do? Collateral damage. You see, so it doesn't, the whole idea that they waste so much time trying to waste this time in these like mental exercises that doesn't lead anywhere. And even when they say, okay, you kill them, yeah, but don't Israel have the right to defend itself? You see how this circular the conversation gets? You don't get anywhere with them.
But there's no historical context, right? Because I feel like there's essentially a system of provocation until eventually the point you made, right, which is that essentially you get a reaction either from Hamas or from other groups, whoever it is.
Yeah.
And as a result of which, when we discuss and talk about, the most recent example is just, well, what about October 7th, right? But that kind of unitary approach to the history of it, you denude it of the context of decades of whether it's oppression, violence, terrorism from both sides enacting it on each other.
No, don't say from both sides.
Okay.
Because this is unfair. You cannot compare an arsenal that is armed to the teeth. You know, it's a nuclear power, and you just like a few militants. You cannot just it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Especially like here's the thing, Israel wants you to think that everything started on October 7th. As if there was a ceasefire on October 6th. Actually, 2 weeks before October 7th, Israel did like 3 airstrikes in Gaza, just regular, normal. And before October 7th, there were 234 Palestinians were killed, 76 of them with children in the West Bank. That's normal. The idea of like they keep pushing you and pushing you and pushing you. So if you throw rocks, they break your limbs. If you take up armed resistance, you're a terrorist. If you sit put in your home, they will come in and use settlers to kick you out, like Sheikh Jarrah. They will take your home and your land away. So there's no point of you doing anything. If you are not even living in Palestine and you choose to boycott Israeli goods, you are not going to be able to work with 37 federal states governments because they have rules against BDS, which is weird that like South Dakota have to have a rule to defend Israel commerce. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. It just doesn't make any sense, and I don't know the whole idea about like trying to make like, oh, but they did this and they did this. No, this is all a reaction. They keep pushing you. As a matter of fact, I don't even know how come the 7 million Palestinians who live inside Israel have not all joined Hamas. There is a very famous interview by Ehud Barak in 2014 when Gideon Levy, he's a reporter in Hearts, he asked him, if you were born Palestinian, what would you do? You know what Ehud Barak says? Like, I would join a terrorist group to fight for my country. And you have all of this in front of them, and the whole idea about Hamas. You have like Netanyahu admitting on tape that he was supporting Hamas and he was like letting money flow to them. It is right in front of you, and they have the audacity to deny it. And so like they look at your face like, I don't care.
When I say both sides, I'm not drawing an equivalence between the actions from either side. I think it's clearly the power dynamic is asymmetrical, right? You know, you have on the one hand occupied people, and on the other you have one of the most high-grade militaries of anywhere in the world. What I mean,
it's the longest occupation in the modern history.
What I mean to say when I say both sides is that violence is exchanged. Yes, the scale of it is different.
Yeah,
but there is certainly still violence that heads from the Palestinian direction towards the Israeli one. That's what I was referring to when I said
Well,
both sides.
I mean, if you put me like against the wall, what do you expect me to do? I mean, you're killing me behind your walls. You're killing me with your drones behind your screens. You're sitting comfortably. You use me as a video games, an X, a square, and a circle, boom. And then you're just like happy that I am in my confined, behind confined walls. And then at a certain point, when the walls are breached, you are going to get face to face with what you have created. Right? Because it's so easy. It's like, because yes, like a Palestinian's taking a knife and going and kill you, that's terrorism. But if I fly in a $64 million F-16 and I boom and like a missile and kill it, like annihilating a whole square, a whole like block, that's not terrorism, that's war. I just boom. Because there's comfort in being remotely removed of killing of all of these people. So you're just like sitting there in your comfortable spaces and pushing buttons and killing of all of these people, and when somebody comes in and pushes a bullet back, it's like, oh, terrorism.
Do you think terrorism's a useful term?
I don't know what you call it. I mean, it doesn't. Here's the thing: we waste our time in defining things. I was in France 24 the other day, and they were asking me, "What do you think? Is this what Israel is like doing? Is genocide? Because there was no genocide in front of October 6th. Like, what? Who cares? Really, who cares? Who cares about the definition of genocide?" And I'd say it's like, how about like other wars, like too much killing, a lot of murders, extreme termination of life.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Does the word genocide bother you that bad? And then you know what? After you go in and you prove it's genocide, well, so what? Israel has the right to defend itself. It's not ending. The thing is, you think you're gonna win a conversation or an argument. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's all a waste of time in order to do that. Remember how, like, for 2 months they were asking, what's a proportionate response, which is the most stupid question ever. Does Israel have the right to defend itself? Well, you know what? I think that Israel has the right to go fuck itself. Seriously. I mean, because this is, like, fucked up.
We create the state of Israel in response to the Nazi horror, the 2,000 years of sort of pogroms and persecution that existed before. And we can say we are appalled by the way that Israel is prosecuting its latest war in Gaza. We can say that we're appalled by some of the things that Netanyahu and his cabinet say and do. But it's a slightly reductive argument, but we come back to first principles, which is essentially that if we want to adopt the position that the state of Israel should exist, we're kind of stuck supporting them in the way that we are.
Yeah, well, I don't think the state of Israel does have a right to exist in the way it does. I mean, I think that there should be a one-state solution, and they should incorporate. Because I've been to Palestine twice, and effectively the West Bank is part of Israel. It's just it's run in an apartheid way. Yeah. They just have little cantons that to get like a mile can take like 4 hours because you have to go through these checkpoints. So there's
different cards if you're Israeli or if you're Palestinian.
Yeah, and like, let's be honest about how Israel's created. Yes, it is a British creation, right? The Balfour Declaration was 1917, so actually, and emigration was happening way before the Holocaust as well. So it wasn't explicitly a reaction to the Holocaust, although obviously that was used as a justification because of the horror that it was that they needed their own country, the Jewish people, but. It was created in 1948 when 800,000 people were ethnically cleansed from Palestine, indigenous people, put in little bits of territory like Gaza, West Bank. And then after 1967, Israel kept on expanding. There could have been a two-state solution. The UN partition plan of 1947, if you look at it, it's like, I mean, the Arab world didn't accept it. Because obviously they wouldn't. Who's going to accept just an imposition of a Western colony? But it's like half and half. Like, and now, if you look at what Israel-Palestine is, it's just like this little strip in Gaza, which is basically destroyed. And then the West Bank is just chopped up into they call it Swiss cheese. That's what Israeli planners call it. So I don't think Israel has a right to exist if that's how it's going to operate. I think that Israel has a right to exist. I don't want to have a state. I don't believe a state should exist based on a one racial or ethnic group being supreme at all times. Because the other thing is 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinian, right? But they have to stay a minority. Otherwise, Israel will stop being a Jewish state, and that's the whole reason for it. So there's a lot of things that are offensive to progressive sensibilities that are mixed up with the fact that, of course, what you're talking about, the history of Jewish persecution and stuff. But the reality of it is it's a horror show. Like the West Bank it's like Desmond Tutu went there many years ago, and it was not even as bad as it is now. And he said it's worse than what we had in apartheid South Africa. So I think that what should happen is that they should allow all the refugees to go home. We don't want anyone to die. We don't want anyone to be killed. All the war criminals should.
It seems such an obvious thing to say out loud. Do you know what I mean?
But there has to be a way to allow some restitution and rectification of the massive crimes that have happened.